My daughter was still wearing a hospital bracelet when I found out my own parents had changed the lock on our door. Not a month later. Not after a long argument. Not after I ignored them, or disappeared, or refused to pay. One rent payment was late by 9 days, because I had spent those 9 days beside an 8-year-old girl who was fighting an illness none of us saw coming, and while I was holding her hand under the cold blue light of a hospital monitor. My parents packed our life into boxes, sold what they could, gave the rest away, and handed our room to my sister. When I stood in their kitchen and asked where my daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit was, my father looked at me like I was a careless tenant instead of his child. Then he said, "You should have planned better." I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I did not beg them to remember that the little girl in the hospital bed was their granddaughter. I simply walked out with an empty tote bag in my hand, because they did not know what my grandmother had written into that house long before any of us needed it. My name is Claire Whitmore. For most of my life, I believed silence was a kind of survival. If my parents were unfair, I stayed quiet. If my younger sister, Natalie, was given the softer version of every rule, I stayed quiet. If my father treated kindness like a business transaction, and my mother called it discipline, I swallowed the hurt and told myself that family was complicated. Then my daughter got sick, and I learned something I should have learned years earlier. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the sound of someone gathering evidence. 6 months before everything collapsed, my divorce became final. It was not dramatic. There was no screaming on the lawn, no broken dishes, no betrayal that would make people gasp. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it sadder. My ex-husband, Mark, and I sat in a lawyer's office under fluorescent lights and signed papers that turned our marriage into a folder. Our daughter, Lily, sat outside in the waiting room, coloring a picture of a yellow house with purple windows. Mark was not a monster. He was just gone in all the ways that mattered. He had already accepted a job in Texas. He called Lily every Sunday when he remembered, sent birthday gifts 2 weeks late, and paid child support most months after I reminded him. But the daily work of raising her became mine. The homework, the doctor appointments, the nightmares, the lunches, the little questions at bedtime that sound simple until you realize a child is if love can leave without warning. The divorce emptied my savings. First came legal fees, then moving costs, then deposits, then the extra bills that appear the moment your life is already on the floor. By the end of it, I had a checking account that made me hold my breath every time I bought groceries. So I did the thing I hated admitting I needed to do. I called my parents. My father, Harold Whitmore, lived with my mother, Elaine, in the old white house on Alder Street. It had been my grandmother Ruth's house before she died. It had black shutters, a cracked stone path, and a maple tree in the front yard that dropped seeds all over the porch every spring. The house was too big for my parents, but my father liked things that made him look established. He liked being the man with a big house, a hardware store, and a family that gathered on holidays to pretend nothing was wrong. There was a finished room over the garage with a small bathroom, a narrow closet, and enough space for Lily and me to fit a bed, a desk, and a little reading corner. It was not fancy, but to us it looked like a landing place, a place to breathe while I rebuilt our life. My parents agreed to let us stay there. Then my father slid a sheet of paper across the kitchen table and said, $800 a month. Utilities included. That is more than fair. The word fair sat in the room like a dare. I wanted to ask if family always came with a monthly invoice. I wanted to ask why Natalie had lived in their guest room for free twice. Once after dropping out of college, and once after breaking up with a boyfriend who owned a condo. But I needed a roof for my child, so I signed the paper. For almost a year, I paid on time. Every month. Sometimes it meant skipping lunch. Sometimes it meant selling things I did not need. Sometimes it meant working until midnight after Lily went to sleep. I did freelance bookkeeping for small businesses on top of my full-time job at a medical supply company. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself pride was less important than safety. What my parents never acknowledged was that I was also helping my father for free. His hardware store had been slipping for years. He hated computers, hated paperwork, hated admitting that the old way of stuffing receipts into a drawer was not enough anymore. So I cleaned up his invoices, organized vendor accounts, reconciled deposits, and prepared quarterly reports. He would hand me messy folders on Friday and expect everything neat by Monday. He never paid me. He called it helping the family. I want you to remember that. It matters later. Lily tried to make the little room over the garage feel magical. She taped paper stars to the wall above her bed. She arranged her library books by color. She named the window ledge the cloud seat, even though it looked out over the driveway and the neighbor's fence. Her favorite thing in the world was a stuffed rabbit named Juniper, with one floppy ear and a blue ribbon around its neck. She had slept with it since she was 3. Every night, no matter how tired I was, we read one chapter together. Lily loved mysteries. She liked stories where kids noticed things adults missed. She would interrupt me and whisper, "Mom, that clue is important." Then she would grin like she had solved the whole world. For a while, I believed we were going to be okay. Then, on a Wednesday morning in April, Lily collapsed at school. I was at work checking an order spreadsheet when my phone rang. The school nurse was trying to sound calm, and that terrified me more than panic would have. "Mrs. Whitmore, Lily fainted during recess. The ambulance is here. We need you to come now." I do not remember driving to the school. I remember red lights looking too long. I remember my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I remember seeing the ambulance near the front entrance, lights flashing without sound, and my daughter being lifted inside on a stretcher with her hair spread across the pillow. First, everyone said it might be dehydration, then maybe an infection. Then came blood tests, scans, specialists, and careful voices. The kind doctors use when they are trying not to scare you while saying frightening things. By the second night, we were at a children's hospital downtown. By the fourth, I had learned the rhythm of machines around my daughter's bed. By the seventh, I knew which nurses used the softest tape, which elevators moved fastest, and which vending machines swallowed dollar bills without giving anything back. The diagnosis was rare and serious, an autoimmune condition that had attacked her body like an enemy. The treatment was possible, the doctors said, but not simple. She needed medication, observation, and time. So much time. I SARMs until my hand cramped. I answered insurance calls in stairwells. I used unpaid leave because there was nowhere else I could be. My parents came once, early on. My mother brought a small balloon from the grocery store and set it beside the bed. My father stood by the door, checked his watch twice, and asked whether the doctors had said when I could go back to work. "I don't know," I said. "She's not stable yet." He frowned. "You have responsibilities, Claire." I looked at my daughter, pale and small under a blanket covered in cartoon animals. "I know exactly what my responsibilities are." After that, they mostly texted. My mother sent messages like, "Thinking of you," and "Keep us updated." But she never asked what we needed. My father sent one reminder that rent was due on the 1st. I tried to pay it. I really did. But Lily's medication copays hit first, then the hospital parking, then the phone bill. Then my paycheck came in short because of unpaid time off. I told myself I would pay my parents in a few days. They knew where I was. They knew why I was late. Surely one late payment, after everything I had done, would not matter more than their granddaughter. I was wrong. On the 9th day after rent was due, Lily woke up after a long fever and whispered, "Mommy, can you bring Juniper? I miss her." That broke something in me. Not loudly, just enough for me to stand up, wash my face in the tiny hospital bathroom, and decide I would go home for 1 hour. I would get her rabbit, her fox pajamas, the little photo album she loved, and the purple sweater she wore when rooms were too cold. I kissed her forehead and told the nurse I would be back soon. Then I drove across town with an empty tote bag on the passenger seat. The house on Alder Street looked peaceful when I pulled in. The maple tree moved in the breeze. My mother's flower pots were lined up on the porch. A neighbor pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that makes betrayal feel even stranger, because the world does not darken for you when your own family decides to be cruel. I climbed the outside stairs to the garage apartment and put my key in the lock. It did not turn. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the key, checked the door, pressed my shoulder lightly against it. Then I saw the bright new scratches around the hardware, the different shine of the metal. The lock had been changed. My first thought was that there had been a mistake. My second thought was that my father did not make mistakes when money was involved. I went to the main house and walked in through the front door with the old key my mother had forgotten. I still had. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and coffee. My mother stood at the counter slicing strawberries into a bowl. My father sat at the table with his hands folded. Natalie leaned against the refrigerator wearing my blue cardigan. That is the detail my mind grabbed first. My cardigan. The one I kept on the back of my chair for cold nights when Lily and I read together. "Why is the garage door lock changed?" I asked. My mother did not look up from the strawberries. "We had to make a decision." "What decision?" My father cleared his throat like he was starting a meeting. "You were late on rent." I stared at him. "I am at the hospital." "Lily is still in the hospital." Natalie shrugged. "I needed the space." My lease ended. Mom and Dad said it did not make sense for the room to sit there empty. "Empty," I repeated. She looked away. I stepped farther into the kitchen. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "Where is our stuff?" My mother finally looked up. Her face was calm. Not guilty, not nervous. Calm. "We cleared it out." "Cleared it out where?" "We sold what we could. The rest went to donation." She placed the knife beside the cutting board, as if the hardest part of the conversation was over. The truck already came this morning. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. I thought of Lily in that hospital bed, asking for Juniper in a voice barely above a whisper. I thought of her books, her paper stars, her school certificates, her little purple sweater. Her childhood had been sitting in that room, and my parents had treated it like clutter. Her rabbit, I said. Where is Juniper? No one answered. Her photo album. My father sighed. Claire, you cannot expect us to store everything forever, because you refuse to manage your life. 9 days, I said. I was late 9 days because your granddaughter almost died. My mother's mouth tightened, not with sadness, but irritation. Don't be dramatic. Then my father said the sentence that burned the bridge completely. You should have planned better. I looked at him. I looked at my mother. I looked at Natalie, still wearing my cardigan. Her fingers curled inside the like even she knew she had put on something stolen. In that moment, I could have screamed. I could have called them heartless. I could have reminded my father that I had spent nights fixing his store records for free. I could have told my mother that a grandmother who sells a sick child's rabbit has lost the right to call herself family. But something inside me went very still. It was not forgiveness. It was not peace. It was the quiet that arrives when your heart finally stops arguing with the truth. I turned around and walked out. I drove back to the hospital with the tote bag still empty. When I reached Lily's room, she was asleep. Her little hand lay open on the blanket, the hospital bracelet loose around her wrist. I sat beside her and watched her breathe. I did not cry. Not because I was strong, but because I was afraid that if I started, I would not stop. After midnight, when the hallway grew quiet and the nurses spoke in low voices, I opened my laptop. Not to post anything, not to write an angry message, not to beg. I opened it because my father had forgotten something important. For years, I had handled the paperwork he was too proud to understand. And a year earlier, after my grandmother Ruth died, I had helped organize old estate files. In those files, I had seen the trust documents for the Alder Street house. At the time, I barely paid attention. Legal language is heavy until you need it. But one clause had stayed with me, because it sounded exactly like my grandmother. Practical, careful, and a little suspicious of the people she loved. The clause said the trustee of the house could not remove or evict a direct family beneficiary during a documented medical emergency without written approval from the trust protector. It also said that if the trustee violated that rule, trusteeship could be transferred to the next named beneficiary. My father was the trustee. The trust protector was an attorney named Daniel Mercer, my grandmother's oldest friend, and the next named beneficiary was me. I sat in the glow of that hospital laptop and read the clause 3 times. My hands were steady now. That almost scared me more than shaking would have. My father had not just been cruel. He had violated the one rule my grandmother had written to stop the house from being used exactly this way. So I started documenting. I saved Lily's hospital admission records. I saved photos of her hospital bracelet and the discharge planning papers. I saved the rent agreement, every payment receipt, the text from my father reminding me about rent, and my bank record showing the payment was only days late. I took screenshots of my messages telling my mother that Lily was still in the hospital. Then arrogance did what arrogance always does. It left evidence. My mother had sent pictures to my aunt in a family group chat. I had not opened the thread earlier because I was drowning in hospital updates, but now I scrawled back. There they were, boxes stacked in the driveway, Lily's bookshelf on the curb, my lamp, our bedding, a plastic bin with her art supplies visible through the side. My mother's caption said, "Finally getting the apartment back. Donation truck comes at 10. I saved every photo." 2 days later, my father left a voicemail. He sounded annoyed, not ashamed. He said I needed to understand consequences. He said Natalie had a right to stability too. He said maybe this would teach me not to expect special treatment. I saved that too. Then I wrote one calm email to Mr. Mercer. No insults, no dramatic language, just dates, documents, and the sentence, "I believe the trustee has violated the emergency shelter provision of the Root Whitmore Family Trust." I attached everything and pressed send. After that, I went back to being Lily's mother. I read to her every night, even without Juniper. A nurse found a donated rabbit in the hospital playroom, and Lily named it Juniper too, because children know how to survive heartbreak in ways adults do not. I answered doctors' questions, learned medication schedules, and smiled when Lily was awake, because she needed to see my face and believe the world was still safe. 3 weeks later, Mr. Mercer called. His voice was careful. He said he had reviewed my email and the trust language. He could not promise an outcome yet, but he would be opening a formal review. He asked whether my father had obtained written approval before changing the lock. "No," I said. He asked whether I had been given notice before our belongings were removed. No. He asked whether Lily was still under medical care when it happened. I looked at my daughter sleeping beside me, a line taped to her hand, her lashes resting on cheeks too pale for an 8-year-old. Yes, there was a silence. Then he said, I am sorry, Claire. Your grandmother was very clear about why this clause existed. I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt like one adult in the world had heard me. Mr. Mercer visited the house the following week. I did not go. I did not trust myself to stand in that kitchen again. Later, he told me my father argued that late rent changed everything. Mr. Mercer informed him that a documented medical emergency changed more. That should have been enough trouble for my father. It was not. Because during the review, Mr. Mercer requested financial documents connected to the property and the small office attached to my father's hardware store. The store had been included in part of the estate oversight because my grandmother had helped fund the building years before. My father had always treated that detail like a technicality. Mr. Mercer did not. He asked for records. My father sent his version. Then Mr. Mercer asked if I had copies of the bookkeeping I had done. I did. Every invoice, every deposit, every vendor statement, every cash sale I had entered before my father took the final reports and handled the submissions himself. I had kept backups because something about the numbers had always made me uncomfortable, even though I never had proof. When my records were compared to my father's filings, the difference was not small. It was not one mistake. It was a pattern. Cash income had been reduced before reporting. Expenses had been shifted. Vendor credits had been hidden. I had not created the false filings, but my accurate records showed where the truth had been changed. I did not expose him out of revenge. I exposed the truth because the truth was in the same file cabinet he had expected me to organize for free. My father called me the day he realized that. Claire, he said, his voice tight, you need to be careful what you tell Mercer. I was in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. I told him the truth. You don't understand business. There are adjustments. Maybe your records were incomplete. They weren't. You were under stress. The hospital, all of it. A lawyer could make it look like you made mistakes. That was when I heard it clearly. Not regret. Not fear for his granddaughter. Strategy. Dad, I said, the only thing I ever did perfectly for you was keep your books. He hung up. After that, my mother began texting again. Soft messages. Careful messages. How is our sweet Lily? Let us know if you need anything. We miss you both. I looked at those messages and remembered her slicing strawberries, while telling me Lily's childhood had gone to a donation truck. I did not answer. Natalie tried once too. She called from my old room over the garage. You're making this bigger than it has to be, she said. Mom and Dad are stressed. You know how Dad gets. Yes, I said. I know exactly how Dad gets. I didn't know they donated everything. You were wearing my cardigan. There was a long pause. That's not fair, she whispered. No, I said. It wasn't. She hung up first. I was glad. Some relationships end with a door slam. Others end with a tiny click and the strange relief of not having to explain yourself anymore. The formal decision came almost 3 months after the day I found the changed lock. By then Lily had been discharged and was recovering in a small apartment I had found across town. It had 2 bedrooms, old carpet, and a kitchen window that caught morning light. It was not much, but every key in that apartment belonged to me. Mr. Mercer called on a Friday afternoon. He said the trust review had concluded. My father had materially violated the emergency shelter provision. Under the terms my grandmother had written, trusteeship of the Alder Street house was transferred to me, effective immediately after the required notice period. My parents had 90 days to vacate. The hardware store inquiry was separate, but moving quickly. The state had requested additional records. My father would have to answer for filings that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with choices he made when he believed no one was watching. I did not celebrate. That surprises people when I tell this story. They expect me to say I danced in the kitchen, or opened champagne. I did not. I sat on the edge of Lily's bed after she fell asleep, and looked at the glow in the dark stars we had stuck to her ceiling. I felt relief, yes. I felt justice. But mostly I felt tired. Revenge in real life is not always a firework. Sometimes it is a signed document, a quiet room, and the knowledge that you are finally safe. The day I returned to the house as trustee, Lily came with me. She was still thin from treatment, still tired after short walks, but she insisted on wearing her purple sweater, the replacement one I had bought secondhand. She held Juniper 2 in both arms. A moving truck was in the driveway when we arrived. My parents stood beside it. Natalie was carrying a box from the garage. When she saw us, she stopped so suddenly the box tilted in her hands. My mother's face changed first. She looked at Lily, then at me, then at the rabbit in Lily's arms. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. My father held a coffee mug like he had forgotten why it was in his hand. For once, nobody in that family had a speech prepared. Mr. Mercer stood beside me with a clipboard. "Are you ready to begin the walkthrough?" he asked. I nodded. My parents stepped aside. Walking through that front door felt strange. The house was the same and not the same. The hallway still smelled faintly of wood polish. The kitchen still had the same clock over the pantry, but boxes lined the walls, and pale rectangles showed where family photos had been removed. It looked less like a home than a stage after the actors had been told the show was over. Lily squeezed my hand as we passed the kitchen. She did not know everything. I had told her we could not get our old things back, because the adults had made a wrong decision. That was enough truth for a child who had already carried too much. My father spoke when we reached the back door. "Claire," he said. His voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "Is there anything we can do?" I turned to him. I thought about the lock. I thought about the empty tote bag. I thought about Lily asking for juniper, while my mother's donation truck drove away. I thought about all the years I had believed being a good daughter meant accepting less love than I deserved. "You already did what you were willing to do," I said. "This is what happens after." He looked down at his coffee. My mother started to cry then, quietly, carefully, as if tears could rewrite timing. But tears after consequences are not the same as compassion before harm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In the end, my father sold the hardware store to settle what he owed. My parents moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town. Natalie found another place to stay, though I heard she complained that I had ruined the family. Maybe I did. Or maybe I was simply the first person to stop protecting the lie that the family was already whole. I kept the house, not because I wanted to live in every room that had hurt me, but because my grandmother had protected that place for a reason. I repainted the room over the garage. I replaced the lock. I turned it into a clean, warm guest suite with fresh blankets, a bookshelf, and a small sign on the desk that says, "No one earns safety. They receive it because they are human." Sometimes a cousin stays there after surgery. Once, an aunt stayed there during a divorce. No one pays rent. No one is reminded to be grateful. No one's belongings are touched without permission. Lily is 11 now. Her condition is in remission. She loves science, especially space, and she can tell you more about Jupiter's moons than most adults want to know. Juniper 2 sits on her shelf, not because she needs it every night anymore, but because she says survivors deserve retirement. Every once in a while, I think about the original Juniper. Maybe it ended up in another child's arms. I hope so. I hope some little girl found comfort in that rabbit, even if it was taken from mine. I still think about my father's sentence sometimes. "You should have planned better." He was right about one thing. Someone had planned better. It just was not him. My grandmother planned better when she wrote protection into a house, because she knew love without boundaries can be twisted into control. I planned better when I kept records no one thought mattered. And when the day came, the truth planned better than all of them. So if you ever find yourself standing in front of a locked door, holding an empty bag, wondering how people who should love you could be so cruel, remember this. Do not waste all your strength begging the wrong people to become kind. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away quietly, keep every receipt, and let what was already written speak louder than anything you could have screamed.